parallel parenting, I think, is the model, the only effective model truly for these high conflict and disordered situations.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Dr. Shafer of Talks with Dr. Shafer. I'm a physician, mom, life coach, musician, author, and I'm passionate about using storytelling as a tool to help you reclaim your story and build your most beautiful future. Now, today we have a very special guest, Carl Knickerbocker, JD, an award-winning lawyer in family law who's an advocate for parallel parenting and is working for reform in the family court system. Mr. Knickerbocker spreads his important message through speaking, representing his clients, advocating for meaningful change in the family law system, and through his very informative and interesting podcast, Unapologetic Parenting. Thank you so much for being on the show, Mr. Knickerbocker.
Thank you, Dr. Shafer. My pleasure.
Oh, I've just been so excited to have this conversation with you. I have been enjoying your podcast, Unapologetic Parenting, and I really love that the title doesn't necessarily tell people that you work in family law, right? And so it gets people there on this premise of just unapologetic parenting. But then once they're there and you've got them hooked, you've got their attention, you're teaching them such important information about navigating this system. You've been tackling a lot of issues through your work to help those coping with high conflict divorce and attempting to co-parent with controlling people. What inspired you to lean into being a part of the solution to a problem you were seeing in the legal system?
Gosh, that's an excellent question. So a lot of it goes back to my personal experience, of course, with going through divorce and custody battle as a lawyer inside of the system. And then just seeing how so many things got, mishandled, seeing how so many things could be done better, then connecting with more people to see just, the ways that they were being mistreated by the system, how much the court system was just kind of detached from reality when it comes to dealing with high conflict cases and high conflict personality types. And started a platform and started kind of putting my story out there and putting some content out on social media. And then noticing very quickly how so many people within this growing community, when it was 5,000 and 20,000 and 50,000, where so many people were saying, I've had the same exact experience. I've seen the same exact thing. They've said the same thing. They all must be using the same playbook, and noticing that it was just this ubiquitous thing, this thing that so many tens of thousands of people could relate to having the same exact experiences. That told me, hey, there's a huge need here. This is something that people need support and education on. And then for part of my own healing process, part of my own, getting through all the custody and divorce and everything else myself, translating all of my experiences into service became a huge drive and motivator to create what we ended up creating with Unapologetic Parenting.
And you've created something really beautiful. And I understand you have many, many followers on Instagram and people who are engaging with the podcast. You're really, really helping people so much with the information that you're putting out there. Now, you've discussed in your platform, as you mentioned earlier, the need for those involved in the court system to be trauma informed. Can you talk about what experiences you've had with the legal system? Again, like you mentioned, from a personal as well as a professional standpoint, that informed your position on this and why you feel it's so important.
Well, on both the personal side and then seeing so many of my own clients, you go into court, and even for me as a lawyer, I'm a litigator. I'm used to the court system. And going through a custody dispute and going through my own case, I noticed I was going into shutdown myself. And I was having just all of these, triggers, shutdown, exhaustion, different things, just vagus nerve burnout, basically, from going through the process. And that was as a litigator, as somebody who's at home in the courtroom. And then seeing how so many other people going through the process those needs weren't being addressed. Their attorneys weren't being conscious of the psychological toll, the emotional, financial, everything else toll that these cases can have on people. And then seeing just the way the court is structured and high conflict hearings, and just how the process itself is just completely trauma blind. And so for so many of these people that I believe going through a high conflict situation, so many of them have histories of mental and emotional abuse. A lot of them have histories of physical abuse. A lot of them have very significant trauma going into the system. And then the system itself is this traumatic machine that is just kind of chewing people up and spitting them out the other side. And so I think it's vitally important for the court system, especially in high conflict and especially in custody disputes, to try to be trauma informed. They should assume up front that everyone in that system has some sort of trauma and they need to be treated as such. And they need to be supported as such. And I think if we did that, that would massively transform the process and the outcomes for people, especially in these custody battles.
I love that. And I mean, I have so many thoughts in response to that, but the most salient one is
Well, let's talk about all of them.
I know, right? Well, the thing that really bubbles to the surface to me, hearing what you just said, is when we take the unexpected out, we kind of take the wind out of the sails of us going in the wrong direction, right? Of trying to make sure that we stay on course. We're all trying to, if we're getting divorced, we're trying to get divorced. We're trying to develop a parenting plan that's in the best interest truly of the children. We're trying to divide the assets fairly, right? That on the face of things is what our goals should all universally be. Unfortunately, as you know, and I know, that's not always what happens. And I love this idea of, instead of coming into the court, and I don't know if you've seen it, I've certainly seen it, when people come into the court and they throw something down on the table, the lawyer, and maybe they haven't started the proceedings yet, they'll behave differently when the proceedings start, but they're talking badly about, oh my goodness, this is so awful, what's happening to this poor victim of a spouse, when they're really just setting the scene. They're making this scene where only one person is the victim. Whereas I like this idea of you discussing that, hey, let's assume everyone's traumatized, everyone's upset. Let's not necessarily come in trying to victimize someone, right? Make them the victim. And instead, let's really just do the right thing for people. But when you're in a coercively controlling relationship, and that led to you filing for divorce, unfortunately, the stage as it stands now in family court is not really set for you to succeed.
Right.
So how do you help people navigate that when you meet a client and from either what they're telling you, from their body language, from the details they've shared with you, that this is going to be an uphill battle because we're going to deal with a high conflict partner who's not necessarily going to be collaborative in the divorce and custody process? How does that process start to try to, one, empower this individual that's seeking the help to just simply be divorced, which they have every right to be, and also help empower them to seek a fair ability to care for their children?
So a lot of that support work, like we're referred to as attorneys and counselors, or at least counselors at law. And so I think that's when we put more of our counselor hat on. One of the things that really helps, at least my clients, be able to handle a lot of that stress and the trauma is just from dialogue. And so I have, myself and then other staff members who have been through divorce and high conflict custody battles. And so we can show up and be like, yeah, we've done it. We've seen it. We get it. It's terrible. It's, here are all the things that validate your experience because we've seen it. And so we offer them listening, we offer them validation, and then we can also offer them just a lot of practical support of, these are the things we're going to let go. These are the things we're going to focus on. And as early on in the process as I can, I start laying that groundwork of these are the reasonable expectations. These are not pie in the sky promises. I'm not going to jump up and down on my desk and, we're going to win everything. Just pay me more money. None of that. It's here's very reasonably and rationally what the probable outcomes will be. And now let's start aligning our thoughts with those things. And then here are the steps. Here's the procedure. Here's what comes next. Here's what it's going to look like and sound like and everything else. And as much as I can educate the client reasonably, that gives them that space to say, all right, I kind of can feel what to expect here. And they can start letting go of a lot of the fear of the unknown in that space. Sometimes if there's a lot more going on where there's somebody who does have a lot more significant trauma, one of the things I'll do is say, why don't you call a therapist who works with, say, EMDR or some different types of treatment modalities that can help them specifically with those needs. And a number of my clients who have worked with counselors who specialize in EMDR come back after a couple months and they're like, wow, that was life changing. That helped me go through this so much better. And so having that, developing kind of that support network of education and then high quality therapeutic care does seem to help people navigate the process a lot better and a lot healthier for themselves and for their kids.
That's such helpful advice. I've even done EMDR here on the show on a prior episode with someone who practices EMDR as a
Oh,
way
like
to show
actually act like showed it.
Yeah, we did it on the show about an experience I'd had and reflecting on that experience because that's the first time I had experienced EMDR. I'd done more of the traditional talk therapy in lieu of, my own experience with, the time leading up to my divorce and then going through the divorce. I found that to be very helpful to have that therapy. But the EMDR was a piece I hadn't tried
Yeah.
before. And I think it's really interesting that you bring it up specifically with divorce and with this knowledge that people are coming into this with trauma and they are going to be re-traumatized in the process, not because, necessarily the court system wants to traumatize them. You as yourself, as someone who felt at home in the court system, you felt it yourself. So I love this idea of helping them access these tools that are within them, but they haven't exercised in the past so that they're going into this long, I hate to say battle, but this long process in court potentially with tools that will help them. Because there are times when you're sitting in that courtroom as one of the, the defendant or vice versa. And those trauma responses are happening to you internally and you're having to cope with those feelings live while you're also coping with getting through that day in court.
One of the other things that to help clients kind of move through the trauma is just the modeling. So being able to show up in a meeting and show them what it looks like to be calm in the midst of the custody action, or what it looks like to respond to a high conflict message with humor, with simplicity, with no emotional reaction. The more we can embody that and show that to the clients, that helps them then adopt that for themselves. And so that's another kind of tool that we'll use as we're counseling and coaching our clients through the process.
Mm. And that's really important because a part of that experience, especially in the process of dealing with a high conflict divorce, which is something you talk a lot about in your podcast, I know you deal with professionally, you are getting messages and you may have been trained in that relationship that you have to explain yourself in lengthy ways. You have to defend, you have to respond. And I think once you start paying more
Right.
attention, you may realize that no response is going to be the end or necessarily respected. And if you give a response to every accusation, you may feel compelled to say, no, that's not true. I categorically disagree with the statement you made. That's not factual, and respond. But your ex-partner might be in turn respond. And then you just end up in that chaotic tornado, but you may have been advised, well, you need to make sure that you refute any negative thing that's said about you so that that statement isn't used in court. Can you dispel any of that for people so that they can take back their energy and maybe not allow themselves to feel so responsible for proving someone wrong who's just stating an opinion, not a fact?
Right. So often that's exactly the cases we see where, the other side will list their diatribe of, grievances. I had one earlier today. I had a client sending me the text messages from his ex, and she's just putting all sorts of things through it and accusing him of this and accusing him of that, and you never did this. And he's like, what do I do? How do I respond to this? And so, again, with modeling, just giving them some different ideas, thanks for the note. That's really concerning that little Timmy is acting that way. And, it sounds like, maybe some therapy or engaging a child therapist would help him work through those things. What needs to happen to set that up for him? And that's it. It was about 4 sentences, short and on point. And then, of course, he does end up sending that. And the response, of course, was all of a sudden there's not really that much of a problem and still a few little barbs thrown in there, but doesn't really want to pursue the therapy thing. And then, of course, then the client said, well, how do I respond to that? Well, again, thank you so much for that response. Keep me in the loop if you continue to notice these behaviors. If they continue, we can definitely revisit, getting him in to see someone again. I'll be more than happy to help. And that's it. And so all the accusations, you just let them pass. They go in one ear, they go out the other, they roll off your back. You're not going to win your court battle in your app close or our family wizard or text messages. So if it's something that you can respond to just say, hey, I'm going to address the need of the child, and I'm going to give something that's constructive and solution driven, and I'm going to do it in 3 or 4 sentences and leave it at that. If there's nothing in there that requires that sort of response to address a need for the kiddo, you just let it go. Just, thanks for the note. Have a great weekend. Or you just don't write anything at all. That's not where you're going to win your case.
I love that because I think sometimes people see these communications, depending upon which viewpoint you have on it, they see it as either a weapon that they can use and they can try to create this framework that kind of weave a web to trap you in. Or from the other side, there can be some real trauma, again, of every time you receive those text messages, right? Oh no, what is it this time? How am I going to respond properly? What are they trying to trick me into saying or doing? And I think I really appreciate you taking a giant step back and saying, yes, you can focus and you should focus on how you respond, right? Don't react, but respond to them. Stay on point. No emotions, future focused. You don't need to even delve into the barbs because they're not really focused on what you care about, which is the kiddo. And just stay focused on that and don't worry about the other things. I think it's such good advice and something that I always try to remind someone in this situation, and I've had to remind myself too. You're not dealing with a person who's different than the person that you decided you needed to no longer be in a relationship with, right? Like, so those same behaviors, unless a lot of growth has happened, which would be wonderful if it did, but if it didn't happen, those same behaviors are going to be utilized potentially against you in this battle. So recognizing that you can take some of the surprise out of it and just say, this isn't surprising. I'm going to stay focused. I'm not going to get caught up in this tornado, I think can be really helpful for people. Can you expand upon why you feel the parallel parenting model can be effective in these cases, like we've been discussing, where there is a lot of conflict and there's not a lot of cooperation?
Parallel parenting, I think parallel parenting one is the foundational model upon which all dual home or multiple home custody arrangements should be based. And for some people, you can build upon that and become far more collaborative and have more of the, you know, more give and take, higher communication, lower conflict co-parenting arrangements. For a lot of other people, especially where there has been a history of physical violence, any form of past abuse, where there is active substance abuse issues in a case, where there are severe mental health issues or personality disorders in play, that's where the parallel parenting model, I think, is the only real effective model for co-parenting. It's going to be the healthiest model for all the people involved, but then also for the children. And so it's the healthiest for a number of reasons. One off the top of my head is if you're dealing with somebody who actually has significant trauma from the previous relationship where there is an abuse history, um, giving that space to just say, I'm going to do my thing and the other parent is responsible for their thing. And we're not going to have this enmeshment and this high frequency contact and exposure. That creates safety and that creates space in which that person can actually focus on healing and getting past their trauma and getting to the healthiest point possible for themselves and then also for their children and their family. When you're dealing with somebody who is just high conflict and has a personality disorder, perhaps, again, going to the parallel parenting model is just the effective boundaries that you need to have with somebody who behaves that way. Otherwise, it's just this constant bombardment of harassment and pathology and just nobody benefits from that. When you talk about long-term strategy for a legal case, perhaps, if you're truly dealing with a high conflict person and you're going to be back in court with this person, you're going to be back on modifications, you're going to be seeing the judge again and again and again. When you sever things out in a parallel parenting model, all of a sudden you have these stark contrasts. You have house A and you have house B. And here, Your Honor, are all the exhibits of A. And this is what life looks like here. And these are the things that I do and how life looks like when it's under my guidance and my charge. And then here's B. And insert picture of dumpster fire or whatever else is going on. It starts setting up this clear dichotomy of what's happening in both homes. And then that helps the court make a much more informed decision of what's really working and what's not, as opposed to when it all gets jumbled together, you can't really tell where one begins and the other ends. And you end up just perpetuating a lot of these negative behaviors and these negative standards. And now, if this one is weighted way down and this house is up here on their standards, this one's going to pull everyone down to the lowest common denominator. And that's not good for anybody. So parallel parenting, especially with these high conflict situations, I think it eliminates a lot of the re-traumatization. It eliminates a lot of the access to just trigger each other. It limits the attention-seeking behavior for somebody who truly is a narcissistic or disordered party. It I think brings the court conflict actually down because everyone's clear on what's really going on. And so it kind of raises the stakes for the person who might be trying to bring a pointless modification or a pointless suit. So parallel parenting, I think, is the model, the only effective model truly for these high conflict and disordered situations.
I agree, and I'm grateful for parallel parenting. I think it's a really effective way to manage parenting when there is high conflict. I think it's also interesting. It takes me back to your discussion about when you're first meeting a client and you know that you're dealing with a high conflict situation and you know that they have trauma, that they'd benefit from therapy. You know, going into it, having already started that journey, I think sometimes we're afraid to seek therapy because we've maybe even been told by that
Yeah.
partner that, oh, you're crazy, and that'll just prove that you're crazy, or you've been told things that make you concerned about how it'll make you look in the litigation process, when really, if it teaches you coping skills that allow you to be your best self, your best parent, and to show up the best you can in court, it's going to help, as you said, delineate the differences between what you're providing in your home environment versus what, if there is a disordered parent involved, what the children are experiencing in that home. Now, if there is clearly an underlying mental health issue driving litigation, and you're seeing the coercive control tactics are being used in the process by the other party, how often do you find that the formal psychological assessment for the custody determination process is actually helpful in diagnosing those issues and directing the custody proceedings in a way that seems fair with regards to those dynamics being there for the kids?
I would say, from what I've seen with, psychological evaluations, they're very hit and miss. Um, and so there have been some where, I've looked at the evidence and taken the deposition of the opposing party, and they're just consistently, I would call them psychopathic. I'm not a doctor, I don't diagnose, but it's very concerning, remorseless, just cruel behavior. And they'll go and they'll have a psychological assessment, and the assessment will say, oh, adjustment disorder. Well, everyone has adjustment disorder during a litigation process. Um, and so sometimes it's like, I think they just completely miss it. The person shows up, they're smart enough to be able to perform well on the exam and do the song and dance, and they get completely by. And I've seen this happen just time and time and time again, where I think the evaluators spend a little tiny bit with a person who's smart enough to beat a lot of the testing, and they just coast right on by, and there's no finding. I've also seen some of the times where the evaluators, I think, get it right, and they say, oh, this person has borderline traits, or they have borderline personality disorder, or they have this, or they have that. Well, then they follow it up with, but I don't think that that really impacts their ability to parent. And so now it's okay, you have a possible, assessment or a possible diagnosis, but it leads nowhere. It's basically saying, oh, well, maybe get them a little dialectical behavioral therapy and tra la la. It shouldn't, change any outcome in the case. And so it's usually only when you have very extreme findings, where there's, massive untreated schizophrenia or very, very bad substance abuse problems. It has to be very extreme usually before it actually translates into anything meaningful or determinative in the case, if it's going to be presented in court.
That's really helpful information for listeners to understand, people who are drawn to this episode to learn about this, because, you might be recommended to pursue this, and you may end up doing it whether or not, you want to. It might be directed by the court itself. But it's important to understand, like you said, going into it, okay, what is the power of this tool, right? And not have expectations of it that are
Right.
not in line with reality. And I think for those who are in a situation prior to filing for divorce, prior to separating from a coercive, controlling, abusive partner, the children ostensibly have been exposed to that. So that's a form of abuse.
Yeah.
And the children are also potentially witnessing litigative abuse. So they're witnessing the finances being withheld from one of the partners. They're witnessing drop offs that are really traumatic. They're witnessing behavior that's really escalating because of the discord that's happening with the divorce. They're experiencing all of this divorce. And I think, I want to just say for listeners who can't be here to share their voice from what has been expressed to me, there's this feeling of helplessness that, it says in the, best practices, in the best interest factors for children, that if there's been domestic violence or abuse, and if these things have been experienced, that it's taken into consideration. But a lot of people feel that at the end of the day, in real life, in the court system, it doesn't lead to any meaningful change in the outcomes for the children and how they spend their time, even if there has been abuse in the home.
Yeah, it often doesn't. And so, touching on that point, where there's sometimes, past abuse, a past, domestic violence, spousal abuse, anything like that. There are a lot of judges, even here locally, where judges will say, well, it wasn't directed at the kids. So, who cares? Not who cares, but it's, that abuse was maybe directed toward mom or directed toward dad. But if it wasn't directed toward the child, then they say, well, we'll just go with the fit parent presumption and order whatever standard. Or sometimes there could be violence toward one of the other parents, and the court will still allow a 50-50 or order a 50-50 or very close to a 50-50 possession schedule because it did not involve the child. Or I've even seen other cases where there has been violence toward the child, and then time passes and judges will say, well, we believe in redemption. We believe that people can improve and things can heal. And so we're going to gravitate all the way back toward a much more robust schedule. And a lot of times you have to have some pretty dark, very, very significant findings in order to even have a movement. In Texas, we call it the joint managing conservators. So there's joint managing the sole. But to move off of kind of both parents have say to just one parent has say, sometimes you have to have very, very dark facts and a pattern of very significant violence, where I've had cases where, one parent strangles the other and throws them out on the side of the road in the rain, and the judge says, oh, okay, y'all can make decisions together, joint managing, and still gives the other parent a very robust, what is considered the standard possession order under the statutes, still gives that violent parent exactly that because it wasn't directed toward the children. So, these different things as far as, violence standards and how they play in domestic violence, it can be a factor, but more often than not, I see judges just kind of acknowledge it and put the least restrictive thing possible in place. And as long as it doesn't involve the kids, then they just allow the maximum amount of contact between parent and child as possible.
What do you think drives that right now? And do you think that's changed in the last 5, 10, 15 years? Has there been a swing, and is another swing potentially coming with with what's going to happen because of leaning towards 50-50 or leaning towards maximum, custodial time with a parent, regardless of what historically has happened? Because we know that the history, does inform us about what can happen in the future.
I think a lot of what's driving it, I don't necessarily think it's a 50-50 presumption or those things. I think it's just a lot of judges look at it, and to them it's that rational thing that, well, just because someone's violent toward one person doesn't mean they'll be violent toward another. Now, I will
Mm.
say a lot of times they will be more cautious if it's a pre-verbal or nonverbal child, as opposed to an older child who could say, so and so hit me or so and so did this. When the courts see that the child could report if necessary, then they'll err more on the side of following the public policy of the state, which is, as much continuing and significant contact between parent and child as possible. And so I think they're gonna lean toward public policy rather than, try to be overcautious in those situations. There might be a component of judicial economy in that, meaning that they might be thinking that this avoids further subsequent hearings and modifications down the road, and maybe it kind of cuts off a lot of future litigation by just saying, well, instead of us clamping down now and then things go well and we have to have another modification and open it up and have another modification and open it up, instead of these parents being in front of the court 3 or 4 times, let's see where it goes. And if something bad happens, then we can clamp down. But otherwise, we're just going to say, let's go with the presumptions of the state and have as much contact as possible. Perhaps that's how some judges view it. But it is pretty consistent from what I'm seeing that a lot of judges will say, as long as it didn't involve the child directly, then we're going to allow that parent to have as much time possible. I know a lot of people really don't like that, and I completely understand that, because it's basically treating the kid perhaps like a guinea pig. Let's see what this violent person does or doesn't do with a child. And to me, it's a risk. And as a father, I don't want to take that risk with my kids. But, when the vast majority of cases probably do turn out just fine, and the vast majority of cases probably do turn out where no harm does actually come to the child, well, then that kind of validates that judicial thinking that says, give that opportunity to succeed, when you know that you also have to give that opportunity to fail, and it's only going to be the small minority of cases that fail. So perhaps that's some of the thinking that drives it.
Yeah, I think it's important to have that background insight, because I think, when you're going through it, you might be just flummoxed. Like, why is this happening? Why don't they see this? This happened to me. Why aren't they scared for the children? So I think it's important to have that background. I appreciate you sharing it. I think, another thing, as you speaking what it's like from a parent's standpoint, when our children are getting older and they're starting to voice their fears because potentially they've seen violence done upon one of their caregivers by another, by one parent, by another, and then they have to go to that parent, or they've seen how that parent has been treated, or they are hearing how that parent continues to talk about, or their family is saying things about the other parent, and it makes them feel very uncomfortable. And even if they're maybe not in physical danger, they are under consistent psychological damage that's doing long-term harm to them, because they're just living in this feeling of fight or flight all the time because they're genuinely frightened. And I think that's something that parents cope with too, is not only fear for their child to be physically harmed, but when their child comes to them and is saying, I'm scared, or they're saying, I'm so uncomfortable, I ask them to stop talking about you, and they won't, and I don't know what to do, or I can't say anything to them. I just have to sit there and take whatever rules they have and whatever they're going to say about the rest of my family, whatever they're going to tell me to do, I have to do it, because I know I saw how my other parent was controlled. I know I'm not safe to make decisions in that house. And that just sets them up for issues in the future that may have been a big part of why one of the parties in the divorce was seeking separation, because they wanted to teach that child that they did have control over their life, that they were safe.
Yeah. Yep.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned about some of the ideas behind maybe why, we're trying to say, okay, let's just use 50-50. We're going 50-50 because we know that once it's 50-50, we're going to have less opportunity for litigation in the future, which makes sense on the surface of things. But it brings to light, to my mind, the issue of financial implications of a high conflict divorce in the court system. And we see the financial abuse that happens through when you have a mismatch of financial access or ability to make money. Maybe one person's a stay-at-home parent, or maybe one person has all the access to funds and has for a long time. So they've really got the other parent in a financial chokehold when litigation goes on and on and on.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's something that we see in a lot of cases. where there will be one side, even during the divorce process, or I have several cases that are on modification processes, that one side has a lot of money, or they'll have a family member who's bankrolling their campaign. And then the other side, maybe is receiving child support and has a job but has other expenses, but there's just that very large financial mismatch. And the other side is just churning the bills and trying to churn, just as much activity and billing and everything else as possible to try to starve out the other side. And I see this in a lot of other cases where one side will end up just having to fold or sell their assets or sell their home or all these other things, in order to just try to keep up with kind of the scorched earth financial policy of the other parent. None of that's good, obviously, for the child. None of that's good for the families. That's, basically cutting your nose off to spite your face. It's just like, why are you doing this when you're destroying your own kid's financial future and your own, stability for your entire family? But it's a common recurring thing. And so I think on one hand, yes, um, there are parties, there are parents who very intentionally do that. On the other hand, I also think there are a lot of law firms that will have somebody come in who wants to have a fight, and they happen to have a bunch of money. And those law firms are more than happy to help them spend as much of that money as possible. And so it's very easy to say, oh, my ex is doing that, the other parent is doing that. A lot of times it's the law firm doing that. A
Mm.
lot of times it's the firm that's just running the bill. And here's one of the big reasons why I say that is because a lot of times I'll get down to an end of a case that I'm involved in, and we'll beat the other side. I'll get my client something very good. We'll win at court. And we'll have that discussion at the end about attorney fees, and the other side will present their billing. You know, our bills are $75,000, and they have these huge itemizations of everything that they did to prepare for the same exact thing that I've been involved in for the whole time, and my bill's like 10% of theirs. It's like, how did you charge $60,000 to $70,000 when my bill is like 6 or 7? And a lot of that comes down to billing practices. So in another situation, if you had two of those law firms that are both trying to just get as much money out of their clients as possible, you end up with somebody going broke, as opposed to law firms that actually keep their billing contained and very streamlined, that can actually help people sail through that process with the least amount of financial damage. So that's something I see in a lot of cases, and I don't necessarily think that it's always the other party being malicious. I think it's just kind of some unscrupulous business practices by family law firms.
Hmm. That's interesting. And I imagine also, depending upon your court system, do different court systems have different practices as far as to how many services they want involved in every case, you know, how many people they want, if they want to have these assessments, because the psychological assessment can be very expensive as well. You know, how many services they're going to say, no,
Oh
every
yeah.
case needs this. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of times, I mean, there are some cases I'll see where the judges will start off with some of the minimum things. They might say, this is pretty high conflict, I'd like a guardian ad litem appointed. Or maybe there's something really bad going on and they're like, oh, we need to have some drug testing, or maybe we need a psych eval. And they the ones that, at least where I am in Williamson County, Texas, these judges tend to be very, very, very good about being conscious of the cost and expense for these different services. And so the moment somebody says, Your Honor, this is outside of, what is financially good for these folks, they can't afford this sort of thing, or my client really can't afford this, a lot of times the judges will back off, or they'll help come up with solutions that will make it more affordable to be able to still get some of the data that they need. So at least here we have some just wonderful judges that are very aware of those things and conscious of those things. Now, in other cases, I'll just see it's like sky's the limit. Custody evaluation and psych evals and guardian ad litem, and everybody needs a therapist. And then the therapists need therapists, and the dog needs a therapist. I mean, just everybody ends up with a specialist, and it's insane. And all of it is usually to just not really accomplish anything significant in the case by the end. It might be just to move the needle this much, maybe. But people will spend six figures on all these professionals. And as long as people keep showing up asking for it and nobody's objecting, the judge will just keep, sure, go for it. Spend your money however you want. And a lot of times, again, it's usually only to the detriment of the families. You rarely get any kind of significant data that really moves the needle much at all in a case. Now, I will say this to kind of circle all the way back to psych evals. One of the things that I've seen, probably the greatest value that I've seen come out of some psych evals is when it comes back and it does say, hey, there is something actually going on with that other person. And then the person who's, sitting there saying, I just feel like I've been gaslit and emotionally abused, and I've gone through all these awful experiences, and now they have something that they can look at and say, oh my gosh, I'm not crazy. I have something that actually validates my perception. And sometimes that's the most valuable thing. And I've actually had that experience in cases where, it'll come back and there is a finding that the other parent probably has some significant things going on, and, they have some personality issues and whatever have you. And it might not be determinative at the end of the case as far as custody or making any major swing, but it does give my client the permission to validate their own perceptions and experience, and helps them heal and move on. It helps them get that space and that distance to say, okay, now I can see that really was them. And now I can see that my intuition, my perception, my everything else is valid or has some validity to it. And now I can start trusting myself again, and I can reclaim some confidence, and I can heal in a much more significant way with that data. So a lot of times that's one of the best values that I see coming out of some of these psych evals.
Well, learning to trust yourself again, especially in these high conflict situations like we're discussing today. We're not discussing, your average two people, something happened, they want to divorce amicably. Those divorces exist. That's not what we're talking about now. And so if you're in this situation and you are not the, to cut corners verbally, not the abusive partner, not the controlling partner, you probably don't have a lot of self-trust. And you're learning this step by step.
Right.
And when you go into really high conflict or unusual circumstances, like being in court, being in a place where you don't know the language, you don't know the social customs, you don't know the implications of, like you said, all of these things that are being recommended for you. And you're just thinking, okay, yes,
Yeah.
yes, I'll do whatever it takes for my child to give them the best outcome, when if you knew better, you might choose better. So I think it's so important, like you said, to give clients, give people that you're working with the opportunity to start trusting themselves again, so that they can make
And
good choices and save their resources. Because at the end of the day, we're not trying to use up a quarter of their resources in the process. We're just trying to help them divide it. And then, of course, everyone should be fairly compensated for helping people come to the conclusion that they're asking from the court, which is, please help us get divorced, and please help us make decisions that best support the interests of our children.
what you were just bringing up about self-trust, um, I think that's huge. And self-trust and confidence are just enormous in this whole process. And so one of the most frequent things that I'll work with people, especially in my coaching work, is helping parents reclaim their confidence in who they are as not just individuals, but who they are as parents, and reclaiming confidence in the work that they're doing. And we'll talk about, well, how should I, respond to these messages? How should I respond to, my ex when they say X, Y, and Z? Or how should I respond in these situations, et cetera, et cetera? Behind a lot of that, what drives your ability to have effective responses is your sense of, who I am, your confidence in who you are as a parent. And so when you feel secure in yourself and you're clear on who you are and how you're operating as a parent and what your standards are for communications or engagement, whatever else, when you are clear on that, that informs how you respond. And so when you are secure and confident in the job you have done as mom or as dad, when the other side is throwing garbage at you, it doesn't shake your confidence. And your confidence can then be that filter for all that garbage. And you can say, I know better. I know what I'm doing. I know who I am. I know I'm doing a great job as a parent. I know I'm checking all the boxes on that court order. I know I'm being impeccable with my word. I know I'm being impeccable in my action. I'm proud of it. I'm secure in it. And there's nothing that I need to respond to or defend myself on because I know who I am and I know the great job I'm doing. And this ding dong is not going to upset that by just throwing all this nonsense out there. And so, yeah,
Mm.
reclaiming that self assurance, that self trust, and that confidence is huge in this entire process. And that's just a central core thing for healing. And one of the big things that I always work with every single client on to help them reclaim that and define that for themselves. It drives everything else.
I really love that. And the visualization I get with it is of the reclaiming. You have two people that were bonded, whether they were bonded by marriage or trauma bonded or bonded by, the bounds of abuse, whatever it was that bound these
Mm-hmm.
two people together. And as you're trying to help them extricate themselves from that, it is getting back the trust. So you're no longer looking for the approval of the other party. And for me to really distill it down, it's really coming to understand I am me, you are you, right? This other person
Yeah.
is them. They don't control me.
Yeah.
And just as importantly, in my responses, I need to recognize they don't control me and I don't control them. And I think that's such a huge
Right.
part of learning how to control yourself in the engagement you have with the other party is truly coming to believe it like you believe your own name, you believe your own body exists and that you're
Yeah.
breathing. In that moment is to say, I have control over me and I don't have control over them, but I have control over me in this moment and I'm going to act like it.
That's right. That's right. And
Yeah.
that's one of the best things you can model for your kids is just showing them what that self-confident or a fully differentiated, to throw out that term, being a fully
Mm.
differentiated person, that I'm in control of me, I am accountable for me, it is not mine to control others. And that's key modeling for your children to see that an empowered differentiated adult that they can then emulate and grow into. But for pretty much all of us who have gone through divorce and custody issues, kind of the longer vision or longer downstream thing is there will be other relationships. And getting to the heart of that confidence and that ability to differentiate, that is what drives successful relationships down the road. So it's not just how do I deal with my ex here and how do I communicate here, and not just how do I, model healthy things for my kids, but how do I set myself up for the best success to have these, engaged, healthy, passionate relationships downstream from here. And one of the core things to that, there's a great book, it's Passionate Marriage by Robert Schnark. that talks about differentiation and the importance, just the huge importance of differentiation. And so the more that we can get to that point, it's going to help us in the short term, and it's going to help us all the way downstream. And that's why so much of what I talk about with unapologetic parenting and parallel parenting and everything else, it is all based on differentiation. It is all based on, this is me, my home, my boundaries, my parenting, who I am, and owning 100% for yourself, and being just accountable for you, and allowing others to do the same. And if from that position of two fully differentiated people, or homes or whatever, if they find that they can resonate and work together, then that can be a beautiful thing. If they're completely dissonant, then that tells you that doesn't work. That's not a relationship to continue. And so differentiation is kind of the bedrock of everything. So even below, just defining your boundaries or defining your communication standards, all of that goes back to the sense of being differentiated, owning yourself, being wholly accountable for everything and anything in and of yourself.
I love your focus on that. And I think if we could give a growth work assignment for this entire episode, because everything you've shared has been so incredibly impactful and important, especially if you're on this journey of learning how to parallel parent and going through a high conflict divorce. But just being a human, learning how to differentiate and to really come into your own, that's the best growth work that we can give, I think, from this hour. So that's a beautiful, and I appreciate you sharing that insight with our listeners. Now, when you're learning how to differentiate and stay centered and stay focused on solving problems, and you've already gone through a lot in the court system, you're trying to get a rhythm, and now you've gone from potentially living in the same home to now navigating things like child transfers, something that maybe you weren't thinking about planning for, but here it is, and you have to figure out how to do it in this high conflict setting. What advice do you have for people in a high conflict setting to try to minimize the potential trauma or drama surrounding those exchanges?
Oh, yeah. Child exchanges are always one of those flashpoint opportunities. Um, a lot of times, again, it depends on the age of the child. Um, when they're young, sometimes just having a public location is going to be best. If they're little, you could, decide whether, doing an exchange, like at a park or a coffee shop or somewhere like that, where there's just kind of that easy handoff. That can be, what works. When they're a little bit older, if they're if you have the dynamics where you could just kind of pull up in front of your ex's place and say, all right, kids, see you later, and they jump out and walk up to the front doorstep, that's usually all that's required. um, when you get into school age children, having as many exchanges through school is always best. So it's just one parent drops off at school and the other one picks up after school, or they just ride the bus home. And it's kind of that no touch, no contact exchange. Those always work best. If you do have to do an in-person exchange and you both are kind of in the same area, just no talking about the case, no talking about questions that you have, no anything like that. Just keep it, as upbeat as possible for the child, and just, all right, I'm going to see you later, here you go. Maybe fly them around like an airplane a little bit and just hand them off to the other parent, and then you disengage and you leave. um, a lot of times you'll see problems with exchanges when either the other parent shows up. Kind of one of my own personal experiences, we're trying to do an exchange at a Starbucks parking lot, and here come the kids, and one of them's being held like this, and you haven't responded to my sort of thing. It's just, no, we're not doing this. Kids, get in the car. Thank you very much. You can send an email. And of course, you're the devil for doing that, but that's kind of how you handle that. So that's a big no-no for situations, not dragging stuff in front of the kids. Or one of the other things that sometimes actually fuels a lot of the problems, at least for the child during exchanges, is sometimes, the parental behavior. So it's the, oh, I can't let you go. Look how upset. And it's like the parent is kind of transferring all this anxiety and upsettedness onto the child and hanging on to them and making this big to do and making the child kind of feel like they have to have a problem with the exchange. Sometimes that's kind of a driving factor if you watch the actual parental dynamics. And that can be mom just as much as it can be dad. I see dads do stuff like that all the time to get their kids riled up during exchanges too. Um, so I think just as much as possible, use a third party. As much as possible, keep it really just low key between the parents, and just keep it as short and sweet and just factual as possible. Just, all right, kids, you're going to have a great time. Here you go. See you later. And then you get in the car and you go. So there are all sorts of different ways to do exchanges. Whatever you do for exchanges, it helps to kind of have it clearly defined. So if you're going to use a third party location, have it in your order that you're going to use a third party location. If you have a very, very high conflict situation, use one of those locations where one parent can drop off and then 15 minutes later the other parent can pick up, or a little bit later the other parent can pick up. So again, the transition doesn't have to have the parents actually interacting and the kid can go play for a little bit. Sometimes that's good. Use the school as much as possible, but just kind of whatever you do, just make sure you have it clearly spelled out in your order so you can always rely on that and not have to be constantly shifting things around, because that just creates more chaos and trauma for everybody.
Yeah, those are such excellent tips. And I just want to say, for people who haven't necessarily witnessed it, maybe they're early on in the process, you may even be well-meaning, perhaps, in the way you're saying goodbye to your child. That's really dramatizing it. You may just think, oh, I need to make sure that they know I'll miss them. But you're not seeing then what they experience for 1 or 2 days after, as they cope with their emotional response to that, when really they have enough to cope with just going from one environment to another. So I love how you talk about that. And I think it's really important, just like everything we're doing when we're thinking about child custody issues after or during a divorce, is just really keeping it really child centered. Their childhood is so short. We are their stewards for a short period of time. And how can we help navigate with them through this so that it is as little drama, as little trauma as possible, just to help them navigate it, like we said, and just move forward as a family.
And something you touched on there, I think, is really, really good. That concept of, a lot of times we will unintentionally say things or do things that kind of make it a little more difficult. And you use that phrase like, I'll miss you. And so that comes up a lot in these situations where, you'll have your little one and, I'm going to miss you and I can't wait to see you. Or sometimes we'll say, oh, I miss you so much when you're gone. And sometimes the kids become aware, like, oh, I might, cry while you're away, or I'm kind of sad, or this or that. And that's all usually well intentioned, and is usually just being vulnerable and candid with a child. But there's the other side of that coin of, what does a child process when they're hearing that? Well, they're hearing that daddy is sad, daddy misses me, my absence causes daddy pain, my absence makes mommy cry. And so what do they naturally want to do? And so sometimes you can be very, very well meaning, and then the child will feel kind of bad about it, feel guilty about it. They might be more resistant to go to the other parent when they normally would want to, because they know that that's going to be causing the other parent pain. And again, these are unintentional things. I don't think anyone's being malicious here. We should never ascribe to malice that which can be, ascribed to things like fear or hurt or something else. It could just be you're just trying to be vulnerable and honest and show the child your emotions. And we're adults too, and or we're humans too, and so sometimes we do overshare and whatever have you. But I think in very, very well-meaning situations, sometimes those messages of, I miss you and I'm sad when you're gone, the child in their own way takes on responsibility for that. That can make transitions and other kind of dual home dynamics a little more difficult for the child trying to process these adult level emotions as a kid.
Absolutely. Again, bringing it back to keeping it child centered and focusing on their experience, and take time for yourself. If you need a therapist, have a support system, have a place for you to discuss how you feel about these things, but not necessarily with your child. There are times when that's not an appropriate thing to do, and you're burdening them. You're not connecting with them. So to have that insight, and I think a good way to do that would be to just ask your child questions. If you think, things aren't going well, my child is really stressed at the time of transfers, even just ask them open-ended questions about what the experience is like for them. Let them know it's a safe space so that they can maybe give you feedback on something that's not going well for them that maybe you could modify.
Yeah.
Again, you can't control the other parent, but you can modify your behavior if there's a way to make it more comfortable for your child.
Yeah. And like, definitely open-ended questions. Big fan of open-ended questions, not leading questions with children. And so, well, what do you think? How could that be different? Those are really, really great ways to address it. And especially if you have older kids and maybe you have a little bit more of a candid dialogue style with them. I've done this with my own kids around the issue of phone calls, but it could also be, exchanges, and just be like, hey, how are exchanges going for you? And kind of see what their response is a little bit, and be like, because I don't know about you, but they kind of suck. And it's uncomfortable. And they'll be like, yeah, right? Okay, well, what can we do about that? What would help with that? What do you think? And a lot of times the kids will come out with some really, really good ideas, and they might just be like, I would rather just be dropped off on the corner. Not literally on the corner, but I'd rather be dropped off like, at the driveway. Or I think this would be better. I just wish we could do it this way. And sometimes that can help inform you on just healthier ways to conduct the exchanges. And so sometimes just connecting with them on that, hey, this sucks level, and giving them the permission to actually be like, yeah, I don't like this, and then invite them to collaborate in giving some solutions. A lot of times they can come up with some really, really good ideas. So yeah, just asking those open-ended questions, giving them a voice, kind of taking that non-judgmental criticism from them, and then implement it. If it's a good idea, do it, or try to get agreement to do it. That can solve a lot of problems in these exchange situations, and also on other issues. Like I mentioned, phone calls. Most kids hate the phone calls, the mandatory phone calls. A lot of them get into that space of just being like, oh my gosh, I don't want to have a phone call. I'd rather just call or have communications if and when I want it, as opposed to the rigmarole of you have to have your phone call right now. Most kids do not like that. And so if you get them talking about it and be like, hey, are those as uncomfortable for you as they are for like everyone else? Or like, what's your experience here? And they'll be like, yeah, I don't like those. Well, what should we do? What do you think? What would you prefer? What would serve you best? And a lot of times they'll come up with some really, really great ideas.
And I love that collaboration because you're modeling a lot of things with them. You're modeling that you trust them, that you're asking them for their opinion, and that you're going to do your best to incorporate that into the solution that they're a part of that, especially when taking a big step back, they didn't decide for you to get a divorce. They didn't decide to live in two homes, which is really important for them to know, by the way, that none of it is their fault. But also, they may feel that they don't have control over their lives, which already as a child, there's so little that they have control over. So letting them know that you care about their experience. Of course you care about their experience, right? Most of us walk around caring more about our children's experience than anything else. But are we communicating that through how we allow them to take part in how their own lives go? So I love that advice. And I think you might have read my mind. I didn't know you had this superhuman ability. But I was really wanting to ask you about things like smartphones as your kids are getting older, because when your children are younger and maybe there were a lot of phone calls happening and the other parent was saying, no, they must sit there for an hour or 2 hours every night because this is important time with their other parent. And you were trying to go along with it, but you were also getting feedback from the kids. We don't want to do this. So then maybe you said, we're not going to do these phone calls. But then the kids are getting older and they're saying, well, I want to be able to call you mom, or I want to be able to call you dad, but the order doesn't really reflect the natural changes that happen when a child gets older, and they probably will have their own phone where they can make phone calls. They're going to get an email account. And are they allowed to email the parent because they're a minor and the court order says they have to communicate through our family wizard? And these things that come up that, they're outgrowing the orders, but maybe because it's a high conflict situation, you are really concerned about going back in front of the judge to sort it out.
Right. So yeah, the communication, calls, evolving technology, all this. I mean, it wasn't very long ago where you had a landline and that was it. And then you had, just the brick phone call thing. And then you had text messaging, and now you have like the world in your hand. And next thing you know, it's, you're going to be able to log into the Matrix and, go to an alternative reality and encounter your avatar parent there. I mean, just all these things are going to end up happening as far as, technology evolving. And we're not keeping up with the evolution of technology. We still don't know just how bad these things actually are for kids, and yet everyone has them. And so that I would digress very easily into that topic. But I think a really good rule of thumb on phone calls or communication with the other parent is it. I borrow this from the Texas Children's Bill of Rights, where there's that concept of the child always has the right to engage reasonable communication or to reasonably engage communication with the other parent. And so when your kid comes to you and is like, hey, I want to call mom, you're like, cool. Okay, you can call mom because you want to call mom. Or, they come to you and like, oh, hey, I would really like to do, you know, whatever. I want to, call dad and play an online game for a little bit. Okay, that's all reasonable. Now, what's not reasonable, of course, would be I want to sit on the phone for my entire time with mom talking to dad, or I want to be on a video call the entire time I'm with mom, and there's dad constantly, kind of in spirit, so to say, through your entire house and entire experience. That would be unreasonable. And so sometimes we'll get into orders and we'll say, there can be reasonable communication. Yeah, the child can initiate reasonable communication with the other parent. Reasonable defined as, between the hours of 8 a.m. and 8:30 p.m., perhaps. Because, midnight calls the other parent, not so reasonable. You should be in bed. Or, these long-winded evening calls. No, you need to finish your homework. You need to go to bed because you have school in the morning. And so I think trying to keep it in those reasonable bounds, and if you can, clearly define what reasonable means and get it in an order, that's the best practice. And so if there's going to be video calls, yes, they can have reasonable video calls, in their room, sort of thing. Or they can have phone calls lasting no more than, X hours per whatever. So sometimes you can put boundaries on there to define what reasonable is. And again, reasonableness, that goes back to your sense of what you do and don't allow as a parent. And so it doesn't really matter whether they're talking to the other parent or their best friend or whoever, calls after bedtime are a no-no, or excessive calls or excessive media use is always a, unreasonable or a not supported thing because of your standards as a parent. And so that's where you have to get clear on what media and device use looks like, and what phone calls and phone privileges look like, regardless of who the child is speaking to. And then you can translate those standards into their other communication. So again, you got to get clear on who you are as a parent and how you want your household to operate. And then that's going to inform your definition of reasonableness. And again, as much as you can get that put into an order, the better, because then nobody has a question about it.
Absolutely. That is incredible advice. And you have given us so much incredible advice. And I do just love to, taking a step back again, the clarity of mind that you are suggesting be an important part of healing and of approaching how to navigate this journey. Taking the time to not just think about what you want, but write it down. If you're in mediation, bring your notes, bring a plan. Be prepared, because that's the way that you're going to get the best outcome for your kids, is if you are prepared and can explain the reasoning behind what you are asking as you're collaborating or trying to collaborate to make a parenting plan. So I think you have given people incredible food for thought today, and I am just so grateful for it. Mr. Knickerbocker, thank you so much for being here today. I have learned so much, and I'm sure our listeners have. I definitely recommend that listeners subscribe to the podcast Unapologetic Parenting for more helpful and supportive information about parallel parenting unapologetically. And certainly subscribe to Talks with Dr. Shafer so that you can hear this as well as other amazing talks from inspiring people just like Carl. Now, Carl, how can people connect with you if they are looking for coaching, legal representation, want to follow along with your podcast and your community? What's the best way for them to find out more about you?
One of the best ways to connect is through Instagram for Unapologetic Parenting. And then you can also go to carlknickerbockerlaw.com, which will take you right to my law firm website. You can then engage us through chat or submit a request. But if you're interested in coaching or consulting work, we'll gladly coordinate with you and get that set up.
Thank you so much, Carl. It has been such a pleasure to have you. And we're so grateful for your insights and your advocacy work for people coping with trying to co-parent or parallel parent with potentially uncooperative partners, and for your work to try to reform the family court system. And we'd love to have you back on the show for more, because you are just a fount of knowledge. Thank you so much for your time and for giving us such an amazing opportunity to learn from you today.
Well, thank you so much as well. I really enjoyed it and really appreciated this opportunity.
And thank you to you, storytellers, for being here. I'll see you next time. As always, stay safe, take care, and I'll talk to you soon.
Hold on to me, and I will try to make There's nothing here to make me wanna stay. Impulse, lead the way. Impulse, don't lead me wrong. Take me where I belong forever. And if that's where you are, never be too far to be together. Everybody's searching, not everybody's finding, so we're one ahead. Everybody's wanting, and I want you to be